Okay, it is 7 o'clock, and I always have a strict policy of starting right on time. So thank you for joining us for a Find Your Fit webinar tonight. I am Mary Pat O'Neill, and I am an independent college counselor in Redmond. And I created the Find Your Fit program at the Lake Washington Schools Foundation. I'm always very proud of the work that the foundation does. Thank you for everybody who donated, even though tonight is free. The money, 100% of it goes to the programs at the Lake Washington Schools Foundation. And I am joined tonight by Cynthia Seidel, who is with Encourse College Counseling, another local college counseling company here in the area. Cynthia and I, this is our third webinar together that we have done. I bring her on because I consider her the expert in international colleges. I always say I know enough to be dangerous about international colleges, or I should say universities. That's my bad. Universities. Cynthia, I'll let you introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your background.
All right. Thanks, Mary Pat. As always, I am very happy to be here and I appreciate being invited. So I, as Mary Pat does, live in Sammamish. However, I'm originally from Canada and I came to the US, married a German. So that's how I got into considering international university options for students. Um, and as far as our own family, we have three daughters, and all three of them had their undergraduate degrees in Canada. One is currently pursuing her master's in the UK. So I have some direct experience through my kids on what it's like to go to other countries for your degree program.
And Cynthia, as I said, I consider her the expert in the area. She visits the campuses of these universities. She knows her stuff. And as I said, this is the third time I've brought her in. We have, if you've never gone on to the Lake Washington Schools Foundation, lwsf.org, their website, if you click on the Find Your Fit page, we any of the presentations that we've done on Zoom, which is one of the positive things from the pandemic, we had to go to Zoom. Anyways, the recordings are there, and we did one more of a deep dive on Canadian universities, I think like a year or so ago.
Mhm.
And then previous to that, we had done one on how students can apply to universities in Canada, UK, and Europe. So tonight, this is being recorded, and the recording and resources will be sent out afterwards to everyone who registered for tonight. I do not send out the resources and the recording. Cynthia doesn't do it. It is sent out by the foundation. So I always say give them about a week. Last week we did a webinar. I think it was 2 days. You will get the slides from tonight's presentation. And we're going to be answering any questions that you have at the end. That part will not be recorded. I'm going to turn that off at that point. But so tonight is more of an overview of the differences. So Cynthia, and this is what I call a conversation. So while Cynthia and I obviously planned out what we're going to discuss tonight, just know sometimes questions come up that I might have, or conversations that we have that we might go in different directions. But anyway, so Cynthia, why don't we start off? Tell tell me, why would students consider US, talking about US students, why would they consider attending an international university?
So there are tons of reasons, but one of the overarching reasons would be that they're interested in a bit of adventure. So if somebody's really comfortable in their home environment or even questioning whether they want to apply further into the US outside of Washington state, they may not be a great candidate for going abroad or even to Canada for that matter. But for those students who are up for that and ready for it, there are a lot of reasons. I've gotten quite a few inquiries this week already from students who may feel that the political environment is more welcoming in other countries at the moment. For example, that's become a huge reason.
Yeah.
One of the other main reasons is the financial piece. And we'll talk more about that. We have some slides coming up with the cost of attendance and the differences in tuition. It's usually quite a bit cheaper to attend universities, often world-class top 40 in the world universities, much cheaper than in the US. And then, of course, the length of the degree, which we'll talk about it sometimes, actually quite often, a shorter degree program for the equivalent degree abroad. Sometimes people have ancestors or relatives abroad. And if you're a Canadian citizen, it's a really good deal to go to Canada.
Oh, it it is. Anytime I hear from someone who's Canadian and they have dual citizen for their children, I'm like, oh, it's
It's a
um,
no-brainer.
and the other thing and we will be talking about sometimes it's a shorter degree program. I think the US universities are starting to think differently. I think we may, I'm not saying it's going to be tomorrow, but I think there will be some flexibility
Mhm.
in the future because US universities, because of their high cost, are looking at other options. So,
Mhm.
okay. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this, but if somebody is planning to apply to a US university, there are five possible things that a U.S. university will ask for um, from the student in their application. High school transcript is always going to be required. Standardized test scores, that could be an ACT or an SAT, and that has shifted a whole lot because of the pandemic and test optional and test blind. A high school activity list, letters of recommendation from high school teachers, and then college essays. So I want to say that so that you understand the components of what a US college application might ask for. So let's talk about the length it takes to get an undergraduate or bachelor degree. Cynthia, why don't you go through that with people?
Yeah, as most of you probably already know, in the US, it's standard for a degree to take 4 years. Although unfortunately, it can often creep beyond that. If you look at the
Yes.
graduation rates, a lot of them are reported in 6 year
Yeah.
time
Yeah,
period.
that's what the US government requires is the 6 year number. And I don't know if this number is still true, but I remember hearing that in the US, 56% of college freshmen graduate in 6 years, which
Yeah.
is a horrible statistic, but
Yep.
okay.
And Canada is similar. It's 4 years. It often goes beyond 4 years. The nice thing in Canada is you pay by the credit you take. So it's not like in the US, where regardless of what you major in, you're paying the set tuition per year. In Canada, it varies depending on how many credits you're taking and what you're studying.
So
Um,
just curious, would a STEM degree like engineering or computer science, would that typically be more expensive than, let's say, I don't know, an English degree?
Typically,
Yeah.
yes. Yeah, business as well, because there
Mhm.
typically are more classes required, more credits required for a business program. But it really varies. And then in the UK, the standard is a 3 year degree. And then Scotland, of course, is 4 years. Scotland's the exception in the UK. So England, Wales, and Northern Ireland are 3 years. But the reason for that is students have to come in at a certain level. Unlike in the US, where you enter in the first year of university is pretty standardized Common Core type classes in the US. And in the UK, you need to know your major from the start, and there's really no off-ramp. So if you start out in, say, English and decide that you'd really prefer to be in computer science or even in something that's a little bit more adjacent to English, say creative writing, you'd probably have to start again.
So again, I know enough to be a little dangerous here. I know when I've looked at schools in the UK, sometimes there's that fourth year, they call it a foundation year. Is that where maybe for a student who isn't as strong to enter would have to do that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. The foundation year can vary. So a foundation year comes before the 3 years of the degree.
Hmm.
And you can apply directly into a foundation year. And the foundation year programs, I won't get too far into the weeds, but there are
Yeah.
different types of foundations. So just because you see one doesn't mean it's the right fit for your student. A lot of them are for international students who don't have strong English language skills.
Mm.
So coming from the US, obviously that's not the one we want. Rather, a foundation year that would be a good fit for somebody coming from here would be one that helps them get the credits they need to qualify for the degree program they want to get
Okay.
into.
Okay. And then how about European schools?
It varies. So three
Okay.
to 4 years. 3 years is pretty standard, but there are a number of them. In Spain, for example, 4 years is more standard.
I just thought of something as I said this is really a conversation of some sort. One of the things we didn't do a slide on was language requirements.
Oh yeah. Yeah. And that matters.
Yes. So let's to stay on this slide. Let's go back. So obviously in the United States, it's English.
Mhm.
Canada, I think, is English and it could be French, right?
It's mostly English, yes.
Right.
And then there are three universities, even in Quebec, which is the French-speaking province, official language French.
Okay.
So there's even three English language-speaking universities in the province of Quebec, and the rest are in French.
Okay.
So most are in English in Canada. And in the UK,
English.
funny English.
Might not understand them, but it's English.
Exactly. But they're English. And then in Europe, there are a lot of English taught bachelor degrees. There are more master's and PhD programs that are in English.
Okay.
And it depends on the country how many English taught programs there are. So if you go to the Netherlands, for example, not very many people in the world speak Dutch. So in order to have a really robust university program and set of offerings across the universities, they need to have faculty that speak English. So there are a lot of English speaking programs in the Netherlands. In France and Germany, that's not so much the case because there are plenty of French and German speaking, Spanish speaking in Spain, et cetera,
Hmm.
to really run enough programs in their languages without having to tap people from other countries.
Okay. Okay. Now let's go through how do the different countries approach undergraduate education?
So in the US, I kind of mentioned a bit of this already. The Common Core curriculum in the first year is pretty standard in many US degrees. Even if you're taking something as specialized as engineering or business, you're still taking those core required classes in other distribution areas, whether it's natural sciences or the arts, et cetera. Canada is similar to the US, but whereas in the US, you have a lot of colleges with the liberal arts curriculum. And Canada has a few of those, but not nearly as many.
Do you want to explain what you mean by liberal arts curriculum?
I thought you might ask that. Yeah. A liberal arts curriculum is, think about it as your high school curriculum, but at a higher level. So just like in high school, you're required to take humanities, sciences, arts, etc. It's very similar in college. It's not as specialized.
Yeah, they believe in educating the whole person in a liberal
Mhm.
arts. So they want to make sure you have a little bit of everything and then a concentration in your major, of course. But
Mhm.
um, that's why sometimes with the liberal arts, people talk about the soft skills that a student can obtain from the liberal arts education.
Mhm. And in the UK, it's even more specialized. It's very hard to find a liberal arts curriculum in the UK that's similar to the US version of liberal arts. So, and then in Europe, it depends. There are several American-based or American-style universities in the European Union, but those are the exception. It's not your public education system. So liberal arts is really something that mostly exists in the US
Hmm.
and a few in Europe and a
And
few
then,
in
and then just going back to the UK, I want to emphasize the point that students need to know what they're studying.
Mhm.
It's not, I'm undecided, I'm undeclared. Like that doesn't really happen there.
No,
Okay.
no.
All right. So I've already mentioned the admissions process. In the US, you often hear the term holistic, which means that they take a lot of different things into consideration. As I said, the transcript, test scores, activities, letters of rec, essays, and again, it depends on the college as to what they're going to require. How about the admissions process for Canada, the UK, and European universities?
Yeah, so it is different. In Canada, they primarily look at the high school transcript, but they're looking at different things. Whereas in the US, they typically, when they look at the transcript, take your grades from ninth grade through 11th or halfway through 12th. In Canada, they sometimes look at different years.
Well, I always find UBC, University of British Columbia, uh, what do they call them, senior, like they take
Hmm.
like, is it six
Senior
class?
credits.
They
Yes.
call them senior credits, which if if you didn't know Cynthia, you might you might think that that meant senior year classes, but that is not what it means. So do you want to explain that just so people understand what we're talking
Yeah.
about, how because and they choose, don't they? It's
Hmm.
not like the student gets to choose what they want them to look at.
They choose, but without any objective of trying to not bring you into the university. So they choose in a way that they would like to admit you. So
Okay.
if a student's applying, say, to computer science, they're going to be looking at a senior level class, six
Which is
senior
typically like
level
an
classes.
advanced placement class.
So yeah, so it could be advanced placement, it could be IB, it could be running start, or it could be a regular high school level class taken in senior year,
Okay.
just to complicate things further.
Yes.
But it depends. So if you're applying to computer science, say at UBC, they're going to be looking at classes such as calculus, physics in most cases, English is usually in
Mhm.
the mix. And then, and don't quote me on this because they might also be looking for something else in particular in that I didn't check the CS requirement specifically before this call, but and then typically your next three highest senior level classes. So they're
Okay.
trying to build you as a very competitive applicant. They're not trying to disqualify anyone.
Mhm.
However, if you are competing for UBC computer science, for example, you're up against a very elite applicant pool. UBC consistently ranks in the top 40 in the world. So you can imagine the applicants that they draw from around the world.
Mhm.
So having pre-calculus is usually not quite enough. It's
Okay.
often going to be calculus or AP
Yeah.
Calculus BC or such. Um, and then UBC also looks at test scores, which are optional, but they can help if they're strong. And they also
And some Canadian universities do require them, right? The ACT or SAT or
strongly
no?
recommend it, I would say,
Okay.
at some. The
Yeah.
University of Toronto strongly recommends it, especially for engineering or computer science.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And then what about the UK?
So the UK is more focused on test scores than it is your GPA. So if you look at the admission requirements for international students to the UK, you'll often see that they only require a GPA of 3.0 or 3.2 as a minimum. But when you start looking at their test score requirements, they're much stricter. So they'll usually give you a few options. So you could have test scores including an ACT score, an SAT score, AP exam scores, IB exam scores, or combinations of those.
Mhm.
But they are much more focused on standardized test scores as
Mhm.
qualifications.
Yeah. I remember, this was probably pre-COVID, working with a student who was applying to UK universities, and I think she was required to submit at least five AP scores along with SAT or ACT, like it was, and they had to be
Mhm.
high, like threes weren't going to cut it. So,
No, no, it's usually quite high, but it depends on the university. It's
Mhm.
like in the US, there are some that are more competitive than others.
And then what about Europe? Similar?
It depends on the school. So there are a lot of American, well, not a lot. There are several American style universities, and they'll be looking at more of a US holistic approach. And then there are a lot.
Can you name a couple? Just because I don't know.
Sure, yeah. So American University Paris, American
Okay.
University Rome, John Cabot in Rome,
Okay.
Constructor in Bremen, Germany, Franklin in Switzerland. So there are quite a few, and they're English taught, and you generally get a dual degree between that country and the US.
Okay.
They're dually accredited. And then they're going to be looking at very similar criteria to in the US.
Okay. Um, so I get a sense, again, I know it depends, but I feel that a lot of times people think that non-US universities are easier to get into.
Mm.
And I've shared this with you before, but like one of my issues and it's just I'm glad you're the expert. So it's it's not like I can look at University of British Columbia and say, oh, their acceptance rate is X because it
Mm.
depends on the major, right?
Correct. Yeah, and that's
So
a really good point because unlike the US, other countries don't publish admission rates because they tend to be a lot more transparent in who they're admitting. So students self-select into whether they're a candidate or not for applying to those universities.
so is like when you say they self-select, is it because they go on to the school
Mhm.
websites or and they
Yeah.
list what like an admitted student profile for that program or
Yes. Yeah.
oh,
And they specify the required classes. And in the UK's case, the required test scores
Okay.
or AP or IB exam scores that would qualify them.
So generally speaking, sometimes students apply in the US to reach schools that you and I were talking about this before we went on live, that it's highly unlikely
Yeah.
that you will get in, just because the student doesn't have the data points and
Hmm.
it's such a highly selective school. So are you saying that generally speaking, maybe students do self-select and they don't apply to schools where they're not qualified?
Yes.
Okay.
And the other thing is, in the UK, you can only apply to a maximum of five
Oh, that's right.
schools or
Mhm.
programs. So even if you're applying to two different programs within the same university, that's two of your choices. So you get five choices.
Does again, I really don't work with students who are applying to international universities. I used to, and then I just decided not to anymore. But am I correct that the UK universities, which use the UCAS
Mhm.
application system, do they not have the statement of purpose anymore?
They do.
Oh,
They
they
do
do.
still have
Did
it,
they
yes.
change it?
It will be
Or
changing a bit. I mean, it hasn't really changed.
okay.
It's changed a little bit in format, but not in the content.
And the reason I bring this up for any of you who maybe know a little bit about US college essays, it's very different. It is all basically proving why
Mhm.
this is your major. They don't care about your extracurriculars or your stories about grandma and all that kind of stuff. It's very factual. So okay.
It's all about why you're qualified for the course you're
Yes. Yeah,
to.
and what you've done to make yourself
Mhm.
qualified.
Yeah.
Okay, so in the United States, you know, as far as the timeline, uh, typically the majority of US college applications are submitted in fall, usually in November. And then there are still some schools that are accepting applications, but I can tell you with my seniors, and you can probably say the same, most of them are all done at
Mhm.
this point.
Yeah.
Um, if I, again, back when I knew more about this, am I correct that in the UK, Cambridge and Oxford have much earlier deadlines?
They
Anyway,
do.
talk about
Yeah.
the timeline for applying, and if we have any seniors who are maybe interested in applying because of the political
Yeah.
climate change in the
Yeah.
US, is there still time to apply? Like that type of stuff. So,
There's a little window of time yet for some schools. So in the UK, the deadline is January 29th.
okay.
It's a very tight timeline though, because of getting a recommendation letter and stuff like that. That's different from the US. So it is a tight timeline, but it's still doable at this point for a senior. And in Canada, several of the large universities, those deadlines have passed, UBC, Toronto, McGill. However, there are still, just in British Columbia alone, the University of Victoria, Emily Carr, and
Mhm.
Simon Fraser are all still open till the end of January.
Oh, okay. Good to know.
So those could still be applied to for any seniors hoping to add an international option.
So, and again, I didn't bring this up when we were talking earlier. My understanding, and I could be wrong with this, international students, which US students would be considered international students,
Mhm.
are their deadlines different than what like a Canadian student applying to a Canadian university, or are they the same?
Depends.
Okay, of course.
Usually they're the same, but there are a few exceptions.
And is it similar to the US where a lot of them are due in the fall, or are they a little later, or as far as
Uh,
deadlines? I know you said January 29th and all that.
Yes, it's mostly mid-January in Canada, but even in the UK. So January 29th in the UK is the equal consideration deadline, which means if you apply by that date, you will have equal consideration with all other applicants for a
Okay,
course. And I keep saying course for the UK. A course is equal, it means major,
major. Okay.
the major you're applying to.
Another question. So in the United States, colleges are supposed to, last year, I think Stanford made up their own deadline, but they're supposed to notify students by the end of March, by April 1st, and then students have till May 1st, although they've changed that date too. Anyways, but typically, students should know by April 1st whether or not they've been accepted in the United States, and then the
Mhm.
college decision day traditionally has been May 1st. How does that work in
That's
the other countries?
Yeah, that's a US thing. So other countries have their own timeline. So Canadian universities, when they have applicants from the US, they are very aware of that May 1st deadline that these students, they're assuming they're going to be applying in the US in most cases as well. But in many cases, they don't give you an answer until say late April
Okay.
or even into May at some of the universities. So what can happen is a student may have to accept and deposit at a US school while they're waiting, say, to hear back from Waterloo or Toronto or something. And it's just, unfortunately, it's the way it is because their system is just much later.
Mhm.
Canadians don't hear back until June in many cases.
Okay. And then what about in the UK and Europe?
So they're rolling.
Okay.
They're rolling admissions. And in
Okay.
the UK, um, it's a very different system, and I won't get into the weeds on it, but you can't, so you can hear back from all five of your choices. But after a certain point in May, you can't hold on to all five offers.
Okay.
You have to narrow it down to two. So
Okay.
people usually will choose what they call an insurance choice, meaning they're likely to
Backup.
fit any conditions, and their reach choice, which would be if they get perfect scores or the scores that they're really aiming for on a good day on their exams. So they'll have their two choices.
So again, going back to the UK being more test score oriented. So let's say a senior needs some AP scores and they don't take the exam till May of senior year and they will not hear back to until July. And as you were saying that they tend to like high scores, so they may
So,
not know for sure that they are going to a UK university if that's their reach, dream, whatever,
mhm.
until they get those scores, right?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
So what the UK does is they'll issue a conditional acceptance and they'll set the scores that are required. And the student often will have, especially if it's AP, they may have AP exam scores from 11th grade,
Sure.
or they may have a really strong ACT or SAT score. So they may get a non-conditional offer, which is
Okay.
amazing. But
Okay.
more often they're going to get at least some conditional offers, waiting for those scores they'll get in July after they graduate. So it's not at all unusual with UK options to again have to choose one of the US schools and deposit while waiting. Or if you have a really good safety choice or insurance choice, I should
Mhm.
say, in the
Yeah.
UK, and you know you've already met the requirements or you're pretty much sure you will, then you can let go of your US schools and just wait to decide between those two choices you have in the UK.
And I'm assuming you have to get a student visa for all of these.
Yes.
Yeah. And
Yes.
is that a hard process?
It's not a hard process. It's expensive. I think it's $853 at this point. I'd have to check the exact amount and it fluctuates with the exchange rate, but it's fairly expensive. However, as we'll talk about with the price of the entire program, it's still
Mhm.
well worthwhile. But it's just a matter of applying and then getting the bio data, that's et cetera. There's a few
Mhm.
steps, but it's very doable.
Okay. Okay. Now let's talk about the cost
Mhm.
of college. So I'll start with the US and then you can take it with the others. But so the United States is known pretty much as being, I think, the most expensive college in the world. Would that be accurate?
Yeah.
Yeah. And, anyone who's ever heard me speak, the difference between an in-state public, and you have an out-of-state public. Out-of-state public tuition is generally three times in-state tuition. And there's private universities. So, you know, on a good day, if you live in Redmond and drive to UW, maybe it's $12,000 a year just for tuition. On a bad day, you could be paying at NYU, I don't know, $90,000 for tuition and room and board, something like. I mean, it's pretty expensive, and it ranges, and there's different things. But let's talk about the other two, Canadian, UK, or three, UK and European. Cynthia.
Yeah. So Canada varies by program and subject and university. So as we mentioned earlier, you brought up engineering, computer science, business. They'll tend to be a little bit more expensive, not double or anything like that, but a little bit more expensive to reflect the extra classes that you'll be
Hmm.
taking. but even for non-Canadians, it tends to be quite affordable.
And just in case anybody watching this is, has dual citizen or whatever, they're Canadian citizens somehow. Um, and Cynthia, you would know the numbers better, but I think the last time we did this, it was something like tuition at UBC, if you were just average tuition, is something like
Mhm.
$5,500 or something like that a
Yeah.
year
In the
versus
US,
which is
yeah.
which is what community college costs in
Yeah,
the
it's cheaper.
US.
It's actually cheaper to go to UBC and pay well, Canadian tuition. One of my
Yeah.
daughters graduated from UBC, and it was cheaper than when her sister was doing a year at Bellevue College.
Oh, okay. Well, you would know. And then how about the UK and Europe?
So the UK and Europe, and I have examples, I think, on the
Yes.
next slide.
Yes. There we go.
Yeah, so just to give you hard numbers, so British Council, which is they handle higher ed in the UK across all of the four nations within the UK. So their quote is that tuition varies from 11,000 to 38,000 pounds a year, which at current exchange rates as of yesterday was between 14,000 to 47,000 US a year, plus about 900 to 1,400 pounds a month for accommodation, groceries, other living expenses. And that range depends on where you're located. If you're in London, it's 1,400 a month.
Yeah.
Almost anywhere outside of London is about 900.
Yeah.
And then depending on if you're living in um, a larger place or really the quality of the
Yeah.
place you're living
It's
in.
like it's like going to school in Nebraska versus San Diego. Cost, it
Yes,
varies.
except you can be in Birmingham or Cardiff
Yeah,
or
that's true.
Manchester, and they're all much cheaper than London. So, and then Europe, it really varies by country, by whether it's private or public, but none of them come close to what the price is for out-of-state US at most of the flagships or most private US universities. And then in Canada, you're looking at average Canadian cost across, sorry, average in Canadian dollars for an international student is 36,000 a year across all students studying in Canada from elsewhere, which is about 25,000 US for tuition, plus about 1,200 to 3,000 a month room and board Canadian. So that would be more like 900 to 2.2 thousand a year. So
Yeah. Yeah. So a huge difference in cost.
it is. And that's for international
Yeah.
students.
Right. Okay. So in the US, US citizens colleges may offer need-based aid and merit scholarships.
Mhm.
And merit scholarships, students don't apply for them. They're based on grades and sometimes test scores. Do international universities offer things like that?
Sometimes. Less often need-based, that's much less common. And sometimes merit scholarships. So in the UK or abroad, it really depends on the university. And they're pretty transparent about that on their websites, those that do offer those.
Would
Um,
you type in something like international merit scholarships, or like if you wanted to find out, how would you?
Usually fees and funding, or
Okay.
funding would be the word to use if you're on a UK website or UK university's website. Um, but they're usually smaller amounts because they're priced more accurately relative to the actual cost of running the program. They're not inflated like a lot of US prices.
Okay. Uh-oh. Why am I frozen up? We were doing so well here.
I can guess what the next slide is.
Well, I could too, except I always laugh. This always happens. So, all right, we'll share again. Here we go. Okay. Why is it? Oh, there we go. Is that the right one? Yeah. Okay. Um, so I know I certainly have heard about, go to Germany, the tuition is free, things
Mm.
like that. So the free or low cost college tuition for international universities, is it easy to get?
So it's not so much whether it's easy to get, it's whether it exists or not. So there are a few countries. If any of you in the audience have kids who speak Icelandic, Iceland has some it's free tuition, even if you're an international student. Sadly, though, there are very few English taught programs. Same with Norway. Germany as well. So there are very few English taught programs in Germany. Um, Most universities in Germany are free for even international students. However, it's hard finding undergraduate English taught programs that are 100% English taught. There are
Okay,
a few, and there is a province in Germany, Baden-Württemberg in the southwest, where they do charge about 3,000 euros a year if you're international, which is still a drop in the bucket compared to a
sure,
US cost.
sure.
But it's more that it's really hard to find free tuition at universities. The best way to get low cost tuition, if you're a European citizen, so if you have citizenship, say in Germany, I'll give you an example. One of my daughters, because my kids have three citizenships, um, born in the US, Canadian mom, German dad, but they had even one of them got into Amsterdam's University College, which is kind of the honors college between the University of Amsterdam and the Free University of Amsterdam, actually, weirdly. I have to think about that one. And it would have been about $4,000 a year US
Yeah,
because of her German citizenship. And it would have been, if I remember right, about double or triple that. So still less than in-state tuition in Washington if she was an international student with no European citizenship.
yeah, yeah, that's amazing.
So there's some good options for lower cost tuition.
Okay, well, let's talk about campus life and culture at the different universities. So, and when I talk about the US, again, it's generally there are certainly schools, universities that don't do this, but generally speaking in the US, campus life is a big focus, extracurricular activities, sports, Greek life, that's, you know, freshmen typically live on campus in dorms, maybe sophomores. You know, anyways, talk about the other places.
Yeah, I'm going to go directly across from the US to Europe, where it's an extreme opposite. So students in Europe are students, like professional students. It's like a job. So they're much more serious, and it's not about the partying or the lifestyle or that part of it. It's much more about what they're studying and learning, and they take it very seriously. It's much easier in public universities in Europe. It's easier to get in and much harder to stay in.
What do you mean?
The grading is very difficult, and there are a lot of what you would call a weed out class in the
Oh,
first or second year.
so they're trying to weed out students or
Um, no, because it's especially say in Germany where it's free, they're not in the business of providing placeholders for
support?
students. Like
Okay.
it's something you are entitled to, especially as a German, to have that free education, but you have to be qualified. You don't just get to spend time there, meaning you have to be a serious student.
Okay.
So there really isn't that
Do they
whole
support,
infrastructure.
how in US, you can have free tutoring and then there's mental health and there do
There's
they
a little bit of that, but at the public universities, there's much less handholding. It's just not a
okay.
part of the culture.
Okay.
At the private American style universities in Europe, yes, because they're American style.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah. And then in Canada, actually, I would say the UK, if we're moving around the circle that way, the UK is a little bit closer to the US in that way, in that there are clubs and societies, is what they call them. And these would be either athletic clubs, they're pretty casual. It's usually not, I mean, they can be competitive, but nothing on the level of
They
US.
don't sports, collegiate sports pretty much only exists in the US as far
Correct.
as what we're used to. There's
Yes.
no NCAA tournament in
No.
Europe.
No. But then there are also professional organizations and groups and clubs and all sorts of ways to meet people and get involved. And I'll just give you an example of my daughter who's at Cardiff University. She's a bassoonist, and she brought her bassoon along, and she was saying, gee, I hope I can get into the orchestra here. And um, she auditioned and is the bassoonist for the university, and the band is
Awesome.
the orchestra.
Yeah.
So it's very, very doable. They're not, it depends on, of course, what you're applying into and if it's something that's hugely competitive, but most of these ensembles, if you're a music student or productions, they're very accessible even if you're not majoring in that field. They want students to get involved, and there are many, many ways in the UK for students to get involved, but it's lower key. It's not It's not as competitive as many of the US.
Before we move to Canada, so with Europe and the UK, do they do dorms?
It depends on the school.
Okay. Because
So
my
in
understanding, I thought they did more like apartments, but they're not necessarily part of the university like they would be here.
so in the big cities in Europe and in the UK, it's not the norm to have a campus style campus. So say you're going to school in Madrid. There's student housing throughout the city of Madrid, and you would be able to apply for student housing, but you would get a single room typically in an apartment with other students. And
Okay.
those students can be from any university or college in the city.
Okay.
So it's not like you're living right by your university, and it's
Or
not
with
like you're
students like who are in your classes with you because
exactly.
they're at a different, okay,
Yeah, and
interesting.
that's typical for London as well. There are a lot more universities outside of the London area, though, that in the UK that do have a more not quite as US focused, but a more similar to the US type of accommodations where you can have on-campus housing or near campus with students from the same university.
Okay.
One thing that the US is also very unique in having students share a room. That
Oh,
is
right. Yeah.
not the norm anywhere else in the world.
Oh,
So in Canada, it's quite unusual as well. It's more,
so a triple would horrify them, huh?
it would. It's very unusual. I mean, there you can get that, and people will do that sometimes to save money, but it's much more common to find single rooms.
Okay. And then how about Canada?
Yeah, so Canada is a little bit more like the US. It's not as big on the Greek system. There are sororities and fraternities, but they're not as huge a proportion of the student body in most cases. And there's definitely sports and they're competitive. If you're a hockey player,
Hmm?
they take that very seriously in Canada. But I would say that's the main sport that would be that serious. Other than
Curling?
that, what's that?
Curling.
Curling? No,
No, they
that's not.
don't? Oh, darn.
I
Yeah.
mean, maybe, but it's not. It doesn't have the spectators and the attention.
Okay. Okay. Well, let's talk about pre-professional programs. And what I mean by that, for those of you who might not have heard that term. So in the United States, some pre-professional programs would be, oh, I would like to become a doctor. I'd like to become a dentist. I'd like to become a lawyer. I would like to become a physical therapist. Like there's like the undergraduate is preparing them to apply to graduate school, whatever level that is. So does the system work the same way in the different international universities? If a student earned an undergraduate degree from an international university and decides they want to come back to the US for their graduate, is that are there challenges with that? Or let's say they decide to do everything internationally and then want to come back to the US to work. Is like, can you talk about just things people
Yeah.
might want to think about? And I realize you
Yep.
don't know all the answers necessarily, but I think you know a lot. So,
Yeah, those are a lot of questions, and it really comes down to if I have a student I'm working with who's really interested in a certain professional or pre-professional program, my biggest question for them is where do you think you might want to practice long term after you're finished your schooling?
and that's hard to know at 16, 17 years old.
It is. But some know they want to come back to the
Yeah.
US, and it's just kind
Hmm.
of a cool option to go to the UK or
Sure.
Canada. Um, and if that's the case, I would recommend staying in the US for undergrad just because it's smoother. So, medical school, you can actually, medical law, dentistry, actually, I'm not sure about dentistry, vet school, architecture, you can enter those programs directly from high school in the UK. However, coming back to the US to practice is another matter. Law school in the UK and Canada, they practice common law, where in the US it's civil, or vice versa. No, that's correct. So the US, or sorry, the UK and Canada, it's easier to get a law degree, say in the UK, and come and practice in Canada. Not seamless, but easier. However, in the US, it typically requires additional schooling and certifications before you can sit the bar exam and practice law, with a few exceptions. So it's not easy. Medical school, the biggest deterrent is getting a residency placement if you've gone to school abroad. It's not easy. It's possible, but students shouldn't look at that as an easier way to get into a professional pathway. Even though you can get in directly out of high school, it creates a lot of challenges down the road if you
So
do.
curious. So if I'm a high school student and I want to become a doctor, and let's say I go to a university in the UK and I get into, I don't know, you said the course, is that a medical, I don't know what you call it there.
Medicine,
So so here in
generally.
the US, it's 4 years of undergrad, 4 years of, so,
Yeah,
so is it just 4 years and then they're technically a doctor?
it's more than that, but it's not as much as in the US.
Hmm.
But the catch would be you'd have to check if you need to be a UK citizen
To
to
practice?
practice and to get the clinicals,
Okay.
things like that. So
Yeah.
it would really be what I would recommend is talking to the individual medical school in the UK that you're thinking about and just seeing what the programs are and what restrictions there would be.
Interesting. So medical school in the US, uh, again, obviously it depends on the medical school, but it can be anywhere from, I don't know, 200, $300,000 for the
Mhm.
program. Is it, and I know we've said the UK is, I'm just curious, do, does a medical degree from the UK, is it more in line with what the undergraduate was, like what you were saying, like
Um,
25,000 a year? Or
it's
I don't mean to put
closer
you on
to
the spot,
that
but I'm just, again,
generally.
this is a conversation, so I'm
Yeah, so
curious.
those programs tend to cost a bit more than, say, an arts program or something, but
Okay.
it depends on the school and it depends on the program. Another very popular degree in the UK is physiotherapy.
Hmm.
Anybody with a physiotherapy degree earned in the UK can practice in Canada, but you might need Canadian citizenship.
Okay.
And they do not translate into being able to do that in the US.
No, because you need a doctorate in the US.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it really, all of these professional programs and pre-professional, it's very, very specific. And the laws change and the regulations change over
Yeah.
time. So those would be individual things to
For
closely
families to
evaluate.
research.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And hopefully people are understanding that it's not a one size fits all process with any of this. So
Yeah.
keeping in mind that we will be sending uh, the slides out. So these are good resources that Cynthia has provided for the different types. And then she made a point of saying another great resource is actually her website. She has a lot of resources. I don't know if you want to talk about any of the resources that are on your website. OnCourse CC, which stands for OnCourseCollegeCounseling.com. So
Yeah. So the resources there, a lot of definitions of terms, but also a lot of international resources like websites you can go to if you're interested in a particular country's programs, stuff like that.
great. All right. So before we wrap up, you know, because I gotta say, thinking about our conversation tonight, it almost sounds like, well, who wouldn't want to go to an international university, especially because cost is an important part of the fit. But you and I both know it's not the right fit for everybody. So what are some things that you want families to know or to consider when they're thinking about international universities?
Yeah, so the biggest thing would be can doesn't always mean should. Just because you can do it and you could get in doesn't mean it's a great fit necessarily. It might be, but there are a lot of pros and cons to consider for wherever you're looking at. And for that reason, I always try to get families to visit in advance, if at all possible, because spending some time on campus or visiting different campuses in a different country can really be eye-opening, and some
Mhm.
of it may be great and really exciting, and some of it may be not at all what you're expecting.
And that's true for any university that
You're
you're
right.
considering, international, domestic. You should visit.
If you
Please don't
possibly
commit
can.
without visiting.
Yeah, exactly. And then preparation, research in advance, tons of preparation to see what their requirements are, what qualifications you need to be a candidate for any given school, what the lifestyle would be like, what the outcomes could be like.
Like
And
what
then
about
the
emergencies and stuff like that?
Exactly. And it's one thing to go to an English taught bachelor's degree, say in Spain, but if your Spanish is not great and you get sick, or you need counseling of some kind, those are available in Spanish, not so much English. So those are considerations wherever you go, just to be sure you're going to be very comfortable dealing with a lot of uncertainty and um, curveballs thrown at you. You have to be ready for that. And then for a lot of students, when we start talking about it, I never try to dissuade somebody, but I also really want to be sure that they know what the situation would be like because it's a huge life decision whether you want to go internationally or not. And for students who start feeling like maybe that's not ideal right now, it's not killing that idea of eventually going abroad because most universities in the US do offer really great study abroad options and they're graduate programs. So in the UK, most graduate programs are taught master's degrees, which are 12 months in length. So you'll be doing research, experiential study, you'll often get published, and it's in 12 months. So instead of having that summer off, it's compressed into that 12-month period instead of 2, 8, or 9-month years. So it's very efficient and the price is great. And it's,
And didn't you tell me earlier that a lot of the graduate program, there's more graduate programs in English, or am I,
oh,
was I?
absolutely, throughout Europe. Yeah.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
okay. Um, so here's how you can contact Cynthia. You just email her at info@encorecc.com. And then I always want families to see me as a resource in the community. So I'm always happy to answer questions. I will usually get back to you within 24 hours, if not sooner. And you can reach me at findyourfit@lwsf.org. And I do work hard to bring a variety of programs. And so if you want to know what is coming in the future, follow us on social media, either Find Your Fit or the Lake Washington Schools Foundation on Facebook and Instagram. I realize most of you are probably high school families, but if you know any middle school parents who are freaking out about their child going to high school next Monday, I'm going to be doing a middle school parents guide to navigating high school. And then on February 11th, I'm going to do a session again for high school students on how to create a balanced college list. So if you're interested in those, please sign up. And then we're going to go to questions. So I'm going to stop sharing here. And I'm going to see if I can figure out how to stop recording, but I don't know. I don't know that I know how to do that after I said I was going to do that. Do you happen to know, Cynthia?
I don't.
Okay.
Actually,
Well, maybe it's under more. Yeah,
yeah, it should be under
stop recording. There
more.
we go. I'm going to
There you
stop
go.
recording now. Okay.